Hello, and welcome to the third episode of the Rhetoric podcast. The last two videos have been about similar topics, so this time it's going to be a little bit different. Of course, the theme of this podcast is going to be using things we've already discussed and have built on. There will be cards shown on the top right of your screen as the video goes on. So I'm going to start by talking about what the Anthropocene is. So obviously today's topic is the government's duty to people against corporations. So what does this mean? We'll get into this finally, and as I go on with this process, I've discovered the fifth topic in our topic sections is usually going to be the main point or what you can take out of this into your own life. So first, I'm going to introduce you to the idea of the Anthropocene. And what this is I'll read you the dictionary definition and what I perceive is the historical Anthropocene definition. And Anthropocene is a proposed geological era that marks the beginning of human-caused changes to the planet. So you see here in Figure 1, we see at least circa 2007, beginning in the 1750s, human footprint on the Earth. So you can see through CO2 concentration, which can be traced, with more humans being on Earth itself, and then factories developing more cattle, all of these things that do contribute to the human footprint. You have the damming of rivers, which is more inherently artificial. Extinctions, which has been mostly due to urbanization and us pushing animals out of their natural habitats for our urban planning, and then land use by humans. Obviously, as the population has exploded over the last century or century and a half, yeah, land use is going to increase naturally. So with all of these four basic metrics for defining what the human footprint is, you can find out that, yeah, the Anthropocene is undeniable, or that this current geological era is something that's being currently influenced, actively influenced, purposefully influenced by humanity. So on this note, what I propose is an idea called the historical Anthropocene. Obviously, there's probably a better word for it, but I'm no, master in Latin or something, so I probably can't come up with the word. So historical Anthropocene is going to have to do. So what is the historical Anthropocene? It is what I propose is a era of intentional decisions and movements based on historical knowledge, which is supported by the masses. So as the normal Anthropocene is the geological era, which defines, the Earth's history. This historical Anthropocene would be defining human history. So I guess would fall into anthropology, but also into like history and sociology. But it's when people can start designing society with intention based on historical knowledge. So, for example, a great example of this would be during the early 20th century, into the mid 20th century, when propaganda was being used effectively and intentionally, right? It was with the understanding that, yes, I know I am trying to manipulate people, not that I'm just trying to, push something like this on, and that I'm going to be making policy decisions based on history, which I understand and the voters understand, at least for liberal democratic societies. And this is the first distinction I want to make because this puts the responsibility for us to craft society in our hands, right? Because we have an understanding of history, anthropology, sociology, political science, because we know that these things exist, that these fields of science exist, we're able to go back and say, yes, we should be able to fix this. We do have a duty to the people and to humanity to make changes as we see fit because we have the knowledge to do so. Now we're going to go into historical models. So historical models is a more, I don't want to say recent, but modern way of approaching history, not as a matter of purely qualitative things, but through quantitative reasoning. So history has many metrics which you can view it as, whether it's economic prices, population numbers, urbanization rates, or even, simply geographical or demographical trends. You're going to find that history rhymes in a way that makes it applicable to use numbers to describe them. And recently, such a historian has been relevant. His name is Peter Turchin, and we will get into one of his works, which is in Ages of Discord, where he describes secular cycles in many different parts of the world, and starting with the Roman Empire all the way to modernity, going through multiple times, such as the 30 Years' War in Britain and I could go on, but he has made a comprehensive mathematical model that using multiple indexes, he's able to basically tell and predict accurately with a certain model when crises are going to happen to the world at large. So here on the visual, you can see a example of a graph he put out in his book, Ages of Discord. So this is specifically about America and starts with, the early republic stages, as it says on the graph itself, and moves on to describe the American Civil War as the first age of discord, which is the ultimate, culmination of lower well-being. And this isn't just, for the slaves, but for poor white Americans in the South as well. So as slave society goes on, I could probably make a video about this, as slave society evolves, inequality increases as increasingly the people with slaves can only afford to buy more slaves or can cut off trade with others, and slaves are restricted to them, so they have all of the labor supply, which leads to, I guess what you might call kulak workers, or people who, own small farms or work on the farms of, richer plantation owners to be pushed out in place for slaves. And what that amounts to is essentially a breakdown of social fabric, which will lead to Age of Discord, number one. And again, that is due to rising, more or less, labor supply. And then you see here post-war prosperity, which is after the World War II, where the American economy suffered greatly before, but recovered, drastically. You can see here the prosperity is just off the charts compared to the beginning of the 20th century. And at that time, the Gilded Age, the second Gilded Age was, the parallel to the 1880s, where we were rebuilding after a certain age, is starting. And that will all culminate in a cycle of the 2020s Age of Discord. So what this means, he doesn't know. What he does know is that based on the well-being index, which is based off of many factors such as cost of living, birth rate, marriage rate, all of these different factors that do more or less describe humanity's current success, you're going to find that he's able to predict that the 2020s will have a crisis, and we're already seeing this now. Although, of course, as of today, the Ukraine war, the Ukraine-NATO versus Russia war is coming to possibly a standstill. Hopefully, I'm not corrected. Although that's happening with China, tensions ramping up. Of course, the Middle East is always a hot spot. You're going to find that, yes, maybe for America, that we will have an era where we're forced to fight for something that we believe in and something that'll fix something that's deeply rooted that's going wrong at the moment. So the next section will be on the Great Wave. So this is also in the modern historical models. So Peter Turchin is less well known and might not be as academically reputable due to his inexperience. However, Hackett Fischer has a reputable experience, and his book, The Great Wave, which I do recommend, has been extremely impactful. So Fischer argues that history is characterized by recurring great waves of price revolutions, which are each marked by inflation or rising price levels, which, same thing. So social upheaval and eventually a crisis will lead to a demographic contraction and societal collapse, which might come through different events, and that these waves are intertwined with social and political events affecting people's mindset. So I wasn't able to finish this book due to its, it's very large, but from reading from the 12th to the 15th century, I was able to pick out a few things that I think are important. Number one is that prices highly impact the way life is lived, and that prices and the price waves, I guess, or the movement of prices throughout history can be predicted not one by one, but by great waves in general, hence the name. So what this means isn't that we can predict history, as many people say, that, history always repeats itself, but more of it rhymes. History is able to be predicted such to an extent that we can see that when something starts to happen, we can usually predict what happens next based on a certain set of triggers. And it is my belief and many others that the triggers have already been set for the 2020s, 2030s to be an extremely impactful period. If you want to see more about how technology plays into this, check out my last video, episode 2. But we're going to keep going on with discussing the modern history models. So here we have two graphs from said book, The Great Waves, about the price revolutions of the 20th century and the price of grain in Western Europe throughout multiple great waves. As you can see, each spike would represent a price revolution. So the 20th century one is more important because that's what applies mostly to us today. And the bottom graph shows the price of grain in Western Europe and how that correlates with great price revolutions and how this impacts crashes. Every time prices go up, they always come back down. And why is that? That's because of population crisis or other resetting measures that are imposed either actively or naturally throughout market forces, for example. And in each of these, what isn't shown, and I couldn't find any online, it exists in the book, but I couldn't find any online metrics for, is that real wages fall. So what is real wages? Real wages is what you earn, or what you earn aggregated against the nominal price index, which is essentially the price level. So if you're making like 20% more, but inflation's 30% up, your real wages are still 10% down, and etc. So when inflation goes up and prices go down, this sets off the cycle of this resetting cycle in history. Whether that's through war, famine, or disease, you're going to find that or revolutions even, you're going to find that once these conditions are set with high prices and low real wages, revolutions do happen. This is most characterized in the, of course, the Black Death, where overpopulation and general lack of faith for the future, at least in Britain, due to low wages because of high population, led to this sort of resetting factor. And famines also play into this. They're the cause, where famines, for example, in 1315, I believe there's a huge famine in parts of France that led to certain cities and principalities being just devastated, and this even leaked into Italy and other places as these populations sunk down to levels where people are able to actually be supported by the current levels of agricultural production. And the reason why this is important, because often modern common sense isn't appreciated as much as it should be. For example, we can all see that something big is going to happen. We already see that AI is making huge impacts, huge waves even in the world. And it's good to have history models quantitatively that back up what more qualitative contemporary people might say or just social commentary might suggest. And that goes into sort of my point about inevitability. Can these modern history models be trusted? And if they are to be trusted, if what they predict does come to pass, or we believe will come to pass, do we need to prevent it from happening, or do we even have the ability to do so? So this story begins with inevitability, with the 20th century and literacy rates. So before the 20th century, roughly, depending on who you ask, 90% of the population were peasantry, or what you might call the uneducated masses that Plato warned about. And these people were not particularly knowledgeable about history, the arts, language even. And what this did is it concentrated power in the hands of a few people who were able to steer society in the way they wanted, which, of course, is a representation of the historical Anthropocene, right? Where you're able to control things intentionally while having full understanding and intention with what the consequences of your actions are going to be. For example, if I put out something with a direct motive to hit some part of your brain that makes you want to believe me, that would be an example of me exercising my if I was an authority, exercising my power as a member of a elite class or ruling class in the historical Anthropocene. However, the difference is now in today's world, so many people have knowledge over the importance of history itself, and what this does is it culminates in a general there's no good way to say this, but that everyone is involved and everyone has a stake and everyone has an understanding in what's going to happen in the future. So, given that for the first time in history, most of the populace, at least in the Western world, has an understanding of history, has an understanding of what makes society go, do we have a duty to see and believe these historical models, general common sense, and try to do something about it socially, right? This we'll expand on in section 5 in government's duty. But unlike times, of course, I'm not saying that no one's involved right now, but people are involved mostly politically, but not yet socially, and so is the government, right? They're as long as we're aware of, the government isn't having a huge part in social engineering, like the Great Awakening, that can be akin to the Great Awakenings of the 19th century. I'm not saying that the government was involved in there, but great social upheavals that are led by community leaders, great social recorrections that actually invigorate the American populace. Does that exist today? I'm not sure if it does, and how that would manifest. And this leads into my main point, which is about the government's duty. So the current perception of the government, at least post-FDR era, is going to be that the government is your antidote to a problem. If, for example, wages are low, unemployment is high, the government should institute some sort of policy to fix this. The government is responsible, not your local community centers, not you, not your dad. It's the government that should be held largely responsible for production and upkeep of society. Now, this is mostly limited to political and economic regions, and I'm not saying the government hasn't had a part in, social engineering and stuff, especially with 2003, War on Terror, all that stuff. But regardless of the fact, government currently doesn't have the wherewithal to actually draw on public support to start changing things, to start enacting propaganda in ways that we wouldn't be able to tell. Now, you might be skeptical of this, given that the FBI had a direct involvement, at the very least in 2016 and 2020, with the elections and the general narrative being put out. For example, we found out with the Twitter files when Elon Musk took over Twitter, and from press releases after Zuckerberg turned more, I guess, Trumpian. Well, we found out that the government has had involvement with companies. They've been embedded with these companies for years now, we found out, and they even have an installed backdoor in Apple products should they need to break in and get, evidence for criminal or otherwise treasonous purposes. So yes, the government does have involvement. However, the public should be able to support the government in all cases. Or should they? What does the government do? What does the society do? What do the enlightened members of the society do once the populace on large are not either corrupted or they are influenced heavily by forces that might be self-destructive? Now, this might sound scary. This might sound Hitlerian, even. That they're invading our culture, and I asked them 5 times to surrender. Whatever it may be, this might sound bad. We don't want the government telling us that we're out of line or whatever. However, this is different from the 20th century. In the 20th century, it was often radical advocacy groups, political party oppositions, or the government itself that was at threat of changing the narrative and changing the impressions of people. That's what the very nation of America is founded upon. It's founded upon a rejection of a monarchical, centralized information system that's able to control what they want people to think. But what if, with the rise of free market capitalism and in today's stage, technocratic capitalism, where a select group of big companies control the whole scene, what if those forces are the ones attacking the minds of our I guess youth would be a better way to put it, especially with the way social media is being peddled now. But what happens when the government isn't the one that's trying to change the narrative and trying to control the people and sedating them and just making them unhappy and unable to actually, do virtuous things in their own benefit? But what if it's these corporation entities? So this leads into more philosophical points: is can the government violate our rights to free speech and more free consumption if it's for the greater good? So we already see ways of this happening. For example, TikTok is a national security concern, and it's been in the news a lot recently with Trump trying to ban it, or no, now he's trying to keep it alive. But when you look at it as a fact, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all these things have been incredibly destructive to the psyches of American youth and just American people in general and across the world. And there's no doubt. Of course, you might say, oh, this allows people to connect better. But sure, use email. That's fine. That's so social media. And of course, I'm not saying I would do. I'm not out of touch. But given that we're here, we might as well use it. But the very existence of these things is somewhat it befuddles me, because you don't expect these things that are obviously bad, that these companies themselves know are bad, to be encouraged, continued. And yes, of course, there's vested interests in the government, with people taking donations and such. But to what degree does the government have a duty to see these things that are like poison, like these, as if it's a drug to our brain that isn't a drug, or I guess it is, with the way it fiddles with our dopamine receptors or whatnot. But when does products and psychoses, psychoses generated by corporations or private entities become worthy enough for government intervention? And that's the main question that I'm posing, and I don't have an answer for, but it's an important thing I wanted to discuss. Does the government have a duty to its people to prevent themselves from hurting themselves by fighting against corporations and their current monopoly, chokehold, and encouragement of degenerate behavior, or in general the overuse of hedonistic apps, items? And that leads from a more practical point, which is yes, about the government and what should it do, into the more philosophical point, is if the public mind is either infected or damaged in such a way that it is destructive to itself, when should the reasonable class of people intervene? So nowadays that might be people who aren't, so into things like AI and social media, and people who haven't been quite sold on the the economic benefits of TikTok. Yeah, it's big, but is it worth, sacrificing the next 50 years of social progress? I think not. But will this ever be palatable to the people? It really isn't, though, because these people, because as Plato said so many times in 2,000 years ago, democracy isn't good, because when the people are misled, you're going to end up with things that aren't good for them. And when the people are misled, you're not going to have the ability, especially in a more democratic, or at least constitutional Republican way, to actually undergo certain processes that are necessary to get rid of these things. Like, for example, China. Like, I hate to say it, of course, given their tyrannical regime, but they're extremely effective in filtering out what's bad and keeping in what's good. I'm not saying that they don't have, like, their own negatives, right? For example, their loneliness epidemic is just as bad, if not worse, as us. But what you see on Douyin, which is their version of TikTok, is tremendous. It's government censorship used primarily for propaganda, of course, but also to encourage good things. So if we could have something like a Chinese sort of control over media, where we're not, temporarily at least, where we're either punishing companies for allowing slop onto their platforms, or encouraging negative things, and while knowing the negative effects on the youth, if we could have that sort of censorship without the propaganda, that would be nice. Well, now whether that's possible or not, or the line between propaganda and bad things bad for you is none. The government tells you that, for example, bad things about the government is bad, or that itself is something bad, and then that's when the spiral begins. But at the current rate, it's undeniable to see that the stakes, the situation we find ourselves in now, is significantly different from battling a monarchical force which imposes will from above. So to summarize, we went over the Anthropocene, which is when humans have had control or intentional use of their power to change the geography. Translated into historical terms, which is when we have the ability and wherewithal to change history with our own intention and full awareness of what our consequences might be. Then we went into the importance of historical models with David Hackett Fisher and Peter Turchin, with, I recommend that book, The Great Wave, and how they're relevant to the discussion of inevitability, which inevitability is when you discuss whether or not these things will come. And if they are to come, if we truly believe that we're going to have a crisis in the 2020s, can we or should we do anything about it now that we know that's going to happen? And finally, number 5, government's duty, we discuss whether or not this is even viable. Now, with these thoughts, it might be easy to think that, the government should do something, or maybe it shouldn't, because it's too tyrannical. The real answer is that there is no concrete answer, and there is a fine balance, and all around the world, different governments are trying different things to try to make sure its people are up to its greatest standard. However, with our fragmented thinking of democracy as the ultimate virtue, we forget that democracy can be often just ruined by the populace just being unable to understand what matters. Terrible things have been implemented, like slavery, which was popular, or majority popular, back in 1790. And does that make democracy right? No, but democracy's main attraction is its self-correcting mechanism. So we hope that, yes, we'll be able to figure something out, that once we can all agree that these little devices that keep us so entranced with them, if we can all agree that maybe these things aren't so good for us, or at least certain apps on them aren't, we're going to be able to come to a compromise and truce to finally win this war. So that was episode 3 of the Rhetoric Reviewed. I hope you enjoyed, and if you have any thoughts, critiques, comments, or criticisms of anything I've said here, or you want to have further discussion, or if you have anything you would like me to discuss, please leave it down below. And it's been the Rhetoric Reviewed. Out.